I have a few thanks to begin with, but I won't go on too long. Thanks to the Women's Library for having me and us. Thanks to you all for coming. Thanks to Rob for asking me to do this and giving me a nice challenge to work with, which at times I have resented, but I'm altogether very, very grateful that I've been spending the time that I have with not only Barnes Graham's work, not only Ben Nicholson's work for a change, but also Barnes Graham's. I also want to acknowledge the help I received from Cassia Pennington at the Barnes Graham Trust, who very generously answered a lot of questions and very patiently answered a lot of questions, as well as Tilly Hayden, who helped navigate me through the archive there. I'm also greatly indebted to Lynn Green, author of the most substantial publication on Barnes Graham titled A Studio Life of 2001, among other things, who generously had a conversation with me while I was preparing this talk. Lynn not only knows Barnes Graham life and work inside out, she also knew Nicholson towards the end of his life, and our conversation really helped me to understand both artists' work better and to sharpen some of my ways of thinking about how to deal with this topic. And so I start with a problem posed by Lynn in her book, and one that she was kind enough not to remind me of when we spoke. So Lynn wrote, and this is from A Studio Life, on numerous occasions during her working life, the criticism, which at times bordered on accusation, has been levelled that her development as a painter has been guided and shaped almost entirely by the example of others. And this, she said, clouds and distracts from our understanding of her own at being Barnes Graham's development. She also wrote, previous analyses of the influences on Barnes Graham's paintings are largely based upon a reading of her work that begins in 1940, with her arrival in St Ives. It has been assumed, therefore, that most of her exemplars were those artists, in particular Ben Nicholson and Noun Gabbo, already established as modernists. Another quotation from Lynn, Barnes Graham did not arrive in Cornwall as a blank canvas, and her career as an independent artist has received too little attention and her personal contribution gone largely unrecognised. So how, as a scholar predominantly of art in West Cornwall, and coming to this talk particularly as a specialist on Ben Nicholson, can I treat this topic without falling into the same well-worn and tired paths? Should I even be handling this topic at all? And I was reminded that when Rob re-asked me to deliver a talk, and we were thinking about potential topics, and obviously Ben Nicholson is an obvious one, given that that is what I mostly do at the moment. I think he said something like, I'm nervous about doing it, but I feel like it should be done. So now that I've told you that I've got quite an unenviable task, I'll do my best in the time that we have. This is not just a talk about Nicholson's influence on Barnes Graham. Rather, I seek to approach this topic from three angles, or from the perspective of three questions, which are, what can examining these artists' works together help us to appreciate better about A, Barnes Graham, B, Nicholson, and C, St Ives, as a complex coming together of artists and artistic traditions in the mid-20th century? Another caveat, and I'm nearly done with caveats. I'm not particularly a specialist in the very, very long life of Barnes Graham. Others would handle tales about the role of Nicholson to her story with a more rounded view. My engagement with her, because of my study and background, which is very much St Ives centred, so because of my engagement with her, because of my study and background being St Ives centred, I don't know at all really the places where she grew up, and I only have a secondary understanding of Edinburgh College of Art, for instance, so I've learnt a lot from others' books. I do have a sense, though, of how she operated in West Cornwall and what it might have meant for her to be there, and also of the different kinds of characters who surrounded her, as well as the local places and the complex socio-political situation of wartime St Ives. I come as someone who is trying in other aspects of my work to build a very detailed picture of Nicholson's career, looking in depth at every single painting and belief that he made. It can be hard sometimes to step back from that, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to consider his interactions with Barnes Graham as a means of drawing out what was particular and or shared. I find that looking comparatively can be very productive. People are relational, and Ben certainly was. How he was with Barnes Graham is not the same as how he was with everyone else, but it can teach us something about him, the roles he played, and his priorities. I hope the same is true also for the study in relation to what it might help to draw out about Barnes Graham. In the late 1930s, Barnes-Graham was a mobile creature on a mission to work in different landscapes. Her journal from 1939 and 40 traces numerous journeys and periods spent working away from home, as well as periods of convalescence. I don't have a lot of handwritten text in this presentation, so you should be okay, but I'm sorry that the focus isn't so good. She was very prone to serious bronchial infections, and like Nicholson, who suffered quite badly from asthma, her health could be very dependent on and responsive to weather conditions. Nicholson had spent considerable time abroad during his early life, sent to recover from ill health to such places as Tours, Milan and Pasadena, on trips that were mostly for resting, but which inevitably involved some painting. This snapshot into Barnes-Graham's movements at this time, so you can see you've got the month on the left, or maybe you can't see, but there's the month on the left, the activity, so you've got convalescing painting, resting, holidaying, the location. This snapshot into Barnes-Graham's movements at this time also show me that she was not particularly an urban painter, another thing she shared with Nicholson. Destinations included Aberfeldy and Glenfarg, Ely on the coast, Aviemore, as well as Carbeth, pictured here, the home of her paternal grandparents, to which her family moved when she was 12. Barnes-Graham described in her wartime diary her journey to St Ives. She wrote, "Arrived after 7 p.m, March 16, 1940, after awful journey 10:30 from Paddington, through dull country, pouring rain and east wind, and then a bit further down, first impression of St Ives was disappointed." She writes that she spent a few nights at Little Park Owls, which she calls delightful home of Margaret and Adrian Stokes, built of Cornish stone. And I'll come back to Stokes and Mellis a couple of times in a bit. She also particularly noted her interest in her collection of what she described as paintings of odd shapes of chiefly cardboard of Old Man Wallace, so she's saying Wallace here, which she misspells, which she wrote were supposed to have influenced Christopher Wood. And then again, Ben Nicholson and Christopher Wood came to St Ives together. These pictures are framed in box-like frames, delightful for shape, in natural coloured linen with glass, and that's her drawing of it, with an example of Wallace's work, which was owned by Stokes at the time she was there, and later presented to Tate, in the kind of frames that it would have been in, or the same frame probably. Barnes-Graham's diary implies she had yet to meet Nicholson, and that she had an existing awareness of him, as well as of Christopher Wood's work. For instance, later she recalled that she had seen Nicholson's work at London's Lefebvre Gallery during the 1930s, on trips to London from Edinburgh, and he had 8 substantial showings of his work there in the 1930s. Now I've set the scene in St Ives, I go back to some slightly more basic introductions to the two main characters. Ben Nicholson was born in April 1894 in Buckinghamshire, Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham in June 1912 in St Andrews, Fife. There was about 18 years between them. In 1940, Wilhelmina was 28 and Ben was 46. Ben moved to St Ives with his second wife, sculptor Barbara Hepworth, and their young, about 5-year-old triplets in the autumn of 1939 as a temporary solution to war. The Hepworth-Nicholsons had also initially stayed with writer and painter Adrian Stokes and painter Margaret Mellis. Nicholson had met Stokes in London in 1936, and Hepworth had known Stokes even earlier. A few months before Barnes-Graham's arrival, the family had moved nearby to a house known as Dunluce, also in Carbis Bay. And Carbis Bay is just maybe like a 20 minutes to half an hour walk along the coast east from St Ives, in case you've not been. So they appear to have been acquainted from 1940, all appearing together at various sherry parties, but nothing much substantial is known about their interactions until a bit later. Likewise, Barnes-Graham remembered meeting Russian artist Noam Gabbo at this time, and Gabbo had also followed Nicholson and Hepworth to Carbis Bay. She remembered seeing his studio and liking him, but I don't think that he and Barnes-Graham developed much of a friendship. Indeed, in 1940, Barnes-Graham's friendships and artistic conversations with these artists were only just slowly beginning. The first artistic exchange between Barnes-Graham and Nicholson that she remembered was him walking into her studio on show day in 1942. She wrote, and this is a reminiscence from the 1990s, "Word had got round that Ben Nicholson was on his way to me. This I thought would be the first time seeing my work, Apprehensive, I started to remove a few works from the walls, when he briskly walked in. Apparently, he said some kind words about a painting being exhibited in the town Guildhall, and her memories of that occasion didn't go much further. However, she did also remember being invited in the same year by Nicholson and Hepworth to their new home, Charing Carris, where they showed her their work in 2 different rooms. She remembered it as a very exciting day. Barnes Graham also remembered Hepworth and Nicholson being very poor. Though relatively well known among modernist circles, she was privileged to see this human side to them. Continuing their artistic work throughout the war was consistently hard for them both. Restrictions included lack of working space, lack of materials, especially for Hepworth, the sculptor, and the needs of 3 young children, as well as occasional visits from Hepworth's son Paul from her first marriage. It's worth remembering that for some of the wartime, Barnes Graham was still mobile, thanks to trains, and not entirely reliant upon physical contact with artists as a means of getting to know their work. As we will see, she had studied art and knew well the importance of engaging with exhibitions, as well as books and broadcast debates. This would have appealed to Nicholson, who was similar. Occasionally, Barnes Graham travelled back to London, as Nicholson also did when he could, and sometimes she would see his work there. A foundational connecting thread that needs to be acknowledged is Margaret Mellors. Between 1931 and 1937, Barnes Graham attended Edinburgh College of Art, with Mellors as a contemporary, though she was very slightly younger. Barnes Graham first enrolled in a foundation course, then later took on a diploma. In 1940, the two were clearly still in touch. Mellors had met her husband Stokes at a Cézanne exhibition, and they had been married in 1938. Together, Mellors and Stokes moved to London and acquired Little Park Owls in Carbis Bay before the war. A big part of the appeal of St Ives for Barnes Graham was that she would have at least one artist friend nearby, and I say this on the assumption that it would have taken some courage to go to the other end of Britain during a war, especially by oneself. Another connecting thread was Nicholson's mother, Mabel. Barnes Graham often recalled how Nicholson took to her because he felt he had Scottish blood through his mother. Mabel's brother was the artist James Pride, and Mabel herself a talented painter, and here are 2 portraits of Nicholson, Ben's youngest brother Kit, as well as Orpin's portrait of the entire Nicholson family, which hangs in Edinburgh. This was a connection that meant a lot to Nicholson at this time. Mabel had died in the flu epidemic of 1918, and Ben had a more troubled relationship with his father, who remarried the year after his mother's death and was himself a successful painter. Ben seems to have idealised Mabel and often proudly highlighted her Scotch purpose. Later, he would often pitch this in contrast to his father, saying how an aversion to pretentious art talk compelled her, and I quote, to go and scrub the kitchen table. Barnes Graham also had a slightly overbearing father in her life, and indeed her and Nicholson were from relatively similar backgrounds, though Nicholson's upbringing was perhaps in some ways more bohemian. Barnes Graham's father, Alan, was apparently also strict and could be very difficult. He was described by Green as an obsessive man who could be very single-minded and who tended to fall out with his neighbours. Wilhelmina would have been considered by many to be from a moneyed and privileged family, but she never felt able to enjoy luxury or to not worry about money. In fact, there were times when she faced considerable financial hardship. Throughout her studies, she had received scholarships. 2 years at Edinburgh College of Art had been funded according to merit. And she also received travel scholarships, which enabled her to spend time in London and to visit Paris, which she did with Mellors in 1937. In 1938, she was awarded another travel scholarship as a post-diploma project to spend time in London and Europe. Unable to take it up abroad due to the political crises, her scholarship was amended on the advice that she study landscape painting and figures with landscape in the UK. Having already made some shorter trips, as we saw on the first page of her wartime diary, it was decided early in 1940 that she could go to Cornwall and use the scholarship there. I get the impression that Barnes Graham had an ability to get on well, flexibly, non-confrontationally with others, and especially with older men. Almost as soon as she arrived in St Ives, she copied out a list of studio spaces and their inhabitants, painting a picture of a generally very traditionally academic painting community. So this is titled The St Ives. It's a copy from a list, I think, titled The St Ives Society of Artists, their show day, with a list of the studios and with their numbers and locations down the left, and the artists on the right who were exhibiting in those spaces. Unlike all of the so-called Carbis Bay modernists, Barnes-Graham joined in the St Ives Society, becoming a member, I think, in 1942. The St Ives Society of Artists had been founded in 1928 and was described by Barnes-Graham herself as very traditional. The key figure in the society for her was Borlase Smart, who then occupied number 1 Porthmeor Studios, and these are artist studios that run along the beach Porthmeor, which is now just in front of Tate St Ives. They're still artist studios. Though she didn't join the society until a couple of years later, ingeniously she managed to procure one of these studios for herself within 3 weeks of her arrival in March 1940. Procured through Smart, it had been let to Commander Bradshaw, who was away on service, and so was let out to her between 1940 and 45. And this, I think, is Studio 3, with, I think it's still current occupier Naomi Fraser's work inside. The ease at which she procured this working space speaks to the relative financial support she had, that being money from Edinburgh College of Art, as well as her flexibility to fit in. She was, I assume, non-threatening, and older men, including also Nicholson, could easily feel paternalistic towards her. Furthermore, though interested in modernism, Barnes-Graham had received at Edinburgh a relatively full academic training, which, as Green points out, was rare among those she would later associate with in St Ives. She could speak the same language as these artists, and at least, I hope, was willing not to involve herself in criticisms of their work. And this was a flexibility that I just don't think Nicholson had in him. As a hopefully quite brief introduction to Nicholson's background, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with Nicholson's or Barnes-Graham's work, so forgive me if I'm telling you things that you already know. I explore his close attachment to the still life genre, which offered a way for him, and indeed many others, including Barnes-Graham, to begin to explore drawing and painting live from the motif, even if it was a still motif, and to experiment with different priorities and means of expression. The 2 paintings furthest left are by Ben, one from 1914, The Striped Jug, and the other from 1923. By 1914, Nicholson had been briefly to the Slade School, which he attended 1910 to 1911. He then spent time abroad, predominantly for his health, as I've mentioned, and having asthma, he was exempted from war service. The Striped Jug seems designed to prove he can paint in a realistic manner. His father, William, a master of the still life genre, whose work I've included underneath the pink one, as well as landscapes, was still very active in the 1930s. This is from 1935 to 6. From 1918, Nicholson kept a studio in London and was part of a circle of artists including Frank Dobson and Wyndham Lewis. In 1920, he met Winifred Roberts and they were married that year. His first significant exhibition in London was shared with Winifred in 1923, and the following winter they moved to Banks Head, a house in Winifred's native Cumberland. Ben's 1923 still life with teapot at the top, I'm sorry it's black and white, I have no idea where this painting is a more radical conception of the relationship between the painting's viewer and the objects presented. It is as if we are stood over the teapot, cup and other objects, creating a new intimacy with the objects which seem to shift slightly around each other in the familiar situation of a slightly cramped corner of the table. Barnes-Graham later remembered making abstract work naturally from a young age. In 1964 she wrote, "Remember painting since I was 8 years old, mainly in the abstract, triangles and rectangles outlined in one colour and filled in with areas of colour." Since 1931, however, she had undergone substantial training at Edinburgh. Her teachers there had dealt with extensively by Green in her studio life, but included William Gillies, John Maxwell, and briefly S.J. Peploe. At Edinburgh, Barnes-Graham would also have attended illustrated art history lectures, including some by Herbert Reed, Professor of Fine Art at Edinburgh between 1931 and 3, and by then already a friend and collector of Nicholson's. In Edinburgh, she also remembered seeing exhibitions mounted by the Scottish Society of Arts, including a presentation of works by Ben and Winifred in 1931, which I know of so ffar only through Barnes-Graham's recollections, I don't know anything else about it, and an exhibition of constructive art, which included Nicholson and Hepworth at Edinburgh's Fine Arts Society in 1937. Gillies himself had studied in Edinburgh and Paris, and at Edinburgh he taught life painting, life drawing, and still life. His works from the 1930s and 40s, to me, speak to the all-over decorative effect of domestic scenes by the likes of Bonnard and Voyeur, as well as the prominent arabesques associated with still lifes by Matisse. His work becomes a pattern that leads your eye over and around his compositions, and we can imagine how Barnes-Graham was taught to appreciate rich, though a restrained range perhaps, of colour, and a painterly application not dependent upon strict linear outlines. Barnes-Graham's still life, here on the right, from 1933, so done towards the end of the general or foundational course, also combines truth to life and imagination, the tilting of a copy of Art's studio magazine, the drama of the folds and bright colours of the cloths, the oversaturation of the colour of 3 apples. It is also an image of the things that she was mostly involved with, namely the still life tradition and an immersion in professional modern art practices, exemplified by the studio magazine. Nicholson's own works made a rare appearance and feature in that magazine, published in December 1932. In this, he denied the importance of a faithful picture of natural objects and suggested instead, and I quote, "Why not judge it as you would a piece of music or any other abstract idea, by its capacity to reveal to you some new quality of truth?" For Ben's development, one has to acknowledge the importance to him and his later career of Winifred's example, especially regarding the freshness of her vision, encouragement of his work towards spontaneity, and her light and colour sense. Winifred's approach to painting was part of a life philosophy. She wrote, "In the new world there would be no false ornament, but clarity, white walls, simplicity." Ben and Winifred had 3 children, born between 1927 and 1931. It was also through Winifred that Nicholson first committed to Christian Science, an approach that also was one that Hepworth's parents had been interested in since her early childhood. Christian Science therefore played an important role in both of these marriages of his and in the ideals that Nicholson shared with both significant partners. As Lucy Kent has pointed out, Nicholson and Hepworth's correspondence during the 1930s is full of Mary Baker Eddy's terminology and ideas, as well as their awareness in life of a single continuous spirit to which all things are subsidiary elements. This, I think, helped Winifred especially, but also Ben, to talk about freedom from physical reality and appearances in life as well as in painting. Painting, furthermore, was surely a means of accessing the continuous spirit they believed in. Nicholson, for instance, wrote to a friend in 1929, "I am longing to get going at painting again. When I do, I feel I shall really get to grips with some sort of reality." Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. Should still be there. Did you see this already? Yeah. I think some paper made it move on. Nicholson left, here is Winifred at Banks Head with their second child, Kate, a seascape by her from 1926, and Ben's 1930 painting of Porthmeor Beach, St Ives, painted on an early visit to the town. The freedom and freshness of his depiction, involving naivety and textural roughness mimicking the weather of the place, is inconceivable to me without the impact of working so closely alongside Winifred, as well as the bolstering effect of seeing from 1928 works by Alfred Wallace. A work by Wallace hangs above the fireplace in the photo of Banks Head on the left. Nicholson left Banks Head in the autumn of 1931. That September he began a romantic relationship with Hepworth, and by the end of November was living and working near her, and then with her, in Hampstead. Winifred, on the other hand, and their children spent time living in Paris, and so from December 1932, Ben was making regular trips to Paris to see her and their children over the next 4 years. Especially in the 1930s, just before his arrival in St Ives, therefore, Nicholson was increasingly connected firsthand with latest developments in European avant-garde abstraction. He met Miro, Calder and Arp during this time, as well as Mondrian. By February 1934, he had made his first white relief. I'll show you one at some point. And in the mid-1930s, was especially engaged with histories of constructivist and constructive art, his chief connection with Russian abstract art trends being his friend Gabo, who moved to London in the mid-1930s. Upon the outbreak of war, Nicholson and Hepworth stayed for 4 months at Adrian and Margaret's house. They then moved to their own place, Dunluce, nearby, and shown here in an annotated photograph. That's Sarah and Hepworth Nicholson on the gate. And in August 1942, onto a larger house, Charing Carris. Forever perceptive about his environs, especially when he enjoyed them, Nicholson's letters from this time are peppered with descriptions of his views and new surroundings. He also went out drawing, in part out of practice, in part no doubt to get out of the house, and in part because he had been asked to exhibit a wall of landscapes by his London dealers. Nicholson agreed on the condition that they would also let him show his latest abstracts. His 1940 Cornish landscape on the right is a typical landscape work from this time, revealing Nicholson's enjoyment of patterns in landscape and of the placement of features within it. The buildings have a somewhat unfinished illustrative feel, left simply in pencil with some shading. Overall, there's a crispness and neatness to it, and it feels also to me slightly like, it also has to me slightly dreamlike sweetness, especially thanks to the inclusion of the outline of a dog character just outside the house, and you might not be able to see it, but it's just to the right of the left-hand building. Barnes-Graham's range of work in wartime reveals, in my opinion, even more considerable versatility. She took on portrait commissions and was not scared to take on unusual subject matter. To me, this commando scaling a ridge is reminiscent of the achievements of a major wartime figurative painter, Laura Knight, who exhibited alongside Barnes-Graham as an honorary member of the St Ives Society from 1942, and that's Knight's work on the right. I haven't worked out exactly what kinds of paintings she exhibited in St Ives in the 40s. Crossing the camps of academic and modern in her range of close contacts in St Ives, Barnes-Graham facilitated an introduction between Nicholson and Worley Smart around 1943 or 4, and in the spring of 44, Nicholson joined the St Ives Society of Artists exhibition as a new member. He shared Smart Studio No. 1 for show day in 44, with the local press picking up on the startling contrasts between Smart's seascapes and Nicholson's geometric designs. Smart was to have a lasting impact on both artists' working spaces. He later moved to No. 5, Portman Studios, leaving open No. 1 for Barnes-Graham, which she kept from October 1946 until 1961. When Smart died in 1947, Nicholson took over his studio, which was then No. 5, which he kept until he left St Ives in 1958. Post-war, Barnes-Graham's local reputation was quickly growing. She had joined a young group of artists known as the Crip Group in 1947, and that year she was also given her first solo exhibition at Downing's Bookshop, which doubled as a venture for art exhibitions, for which she chose to exhibit a selection of Cornish paintings. Looking at these installation shots, I was struck by the stylistic variety of Barnes-Graham's work from the mid-1940s. They seem to make sense together as having been made by one artist, but also show that artists to be experimental with styles and techniques to suit different motifs. Some especially seem to exhibit a more imaginative, even slightly surrealist streak, and others to be more detailed renderings of things seen in and around St Ives, usually done with an enhanced sense of colour. By 1947, Barnes-Graham was also working with especially linear constructions of space, in which prominent foreground shapes are connected to a vast network of lines leading to the middle and far distance. This is Barnes-Graham on the left and Nicholson on the right. Nicholson, in his drawing of 1948, similarly used pylons as a real-world equivalent of the pencil lines he used to connect and to juxtapose stone memorials, headstone text, technological infrastructure, and natural landscape. In 1949, Barnes-Graham went to Switzerland with a young family she met in St Ives, and part of this trip was a visit to Grindelwald Glacier. And I'm mostly not talking very much about the glacier paintings, because I know that was the subject of last year's talk. Is that right? Yes. Scholars, however, seem to be united in a belief that this marks a pivotal step in her maturity as an artist, and Barnes-Graham herself acknowledged the impact of Gabbo and Hepworth's drawings, though not at the time consciously, to her approach to landscape, and to the means she found of expressing the translucency and structure of ice blocks and caverns. Gabbo had left St Ives in 1946, but Barnes-Graham owned a small plastic sculpture of his until the early 1960s, and another version of this one shown here. And top right, that's Ben in the back with some seaweed and Gabbo and his dog on the beach. What Barnes-Graham's glacier paintings suggest to me, even more than Gabbo's evocations of underground caverns, and this is an example of Gabbo's painting in orangey yellow, and Hepworth's drawings of crystalline structures, that's Hepworth's drawing on the right, is the actual landscape slowly morphing and changing, so that when looking at her drawings of the forms, I feel more emphatically aware of change coming, as well as of change having taken place. It was around this time that Barnes-Graham also started to embed herself professionally within the London commercial art market. From 1948, she was regularly invited to participate in group shows at the Redfern Gallery, and she had her first one-person exhibition there in January 1952. In the autumn of 1947, David Lewis, a writer and poet, arrived to live in Zena just along the coast west from St Ives. In October 1949, they were married with Peter Lanyon as best man. Lewis apparently separately met Hepworth and Nicholson in 1948, and from around 1950 to 51, he worked with Hepworth on a catalogue of her sculptures, which was published in 52. From 1949 to the mid-1950s, therefore, Lewis's strong connections with both Hepworth and Nicholson, he also wrote about Nicholson's work a few times, played a role in her and their, as a couple, developing friendships with these other artists. In the spring of 1948 and 49, the winter of 1948-9, the Penrith Society of Arts was founded as a modernist breakaway group from the St Ives Society, and by this point, Borlase Smart, who I think of as someone who was holding different groups together and had died a couple of years earlier. David Lewis was at first a group secretary, then gallery curator from 1951 to 54. This is a photograph of an exhibition, a Penrith Society exhibition in 52. You see Nicholson's work, this abstract little one bottom left, as well as a Barnes-Graham behind the vase. Political rifts, however, were in abundance surrounding the society, and I don't have time really to go into that, but however Barnes-Graham seems to have been able to maintain her friendship through this period. Being friendly with Nicholson and Hepworth, as well as David's role working with Hepworth, however, didn't always make it easy. In September 1949, Hepworth acquired Trewin Studio, where her museum and sculpture garden still stand. Barnes-Graham later remembered, and I quote, "It was always stimulating to visit her studio. Barbara asked about work and talked about work, mostly her own. I was quite in awe of her. I had great respect for her working capacity. I have never met a woman so dedicated as she was," and this is something that I constantly hear in reminiscences from others of Barbara Hepworth. She also stressed, "Barbara, like Ben, taught me a lot about the importance of the presentation of work, the importance of thinking about work. This has been invaluable to me, especially if for some reason I am unable to paint. I frequently think about this advice." Nicholson and Hepworth were, for her, primary examples for being a professional artist. Some strength of friendship is suggested by the fact that, being asked by Hepworth what she would like for a wedding present, Barnes-Graham remembered having had, and I quote, "the awful courage to ask for a drawing," this one here. Around this time, she also acquired a small sculpture of Hepworth's, which later Hepworth bought back. Not directly from Barnes-Graham, but from the art market. At the end of 1949, Hepworth was invited to exhibit 2 rooms of work at the Venice Biennale the following spring. Barnes-Graham and Lewis attended the opening that June as part of a tour around Italy, and Nicholson also turned up, apparently unannounced, which did not go down very well with Hepworth. I'm not painting a very good picture of Nicholson, I don't think, but there were some good things. An increasing friendship between Nicholson and Barnes-Graham in the early 1950s coincided with them both expanding their circles in terms of places and landscapes in which and from which they drew. Between 1950 and 1957, Nicholson made several, and I think it's about 5, visits to Italy. In the spring of 1950, he made a drawing trip there with Cyril Wedihoff, a friend since 1927, They spent 3 weeks in Tuscany, then returned via Ravenna, Padua and Venice to drop in on Barbara at the Biennale. At this time, in case you can't see, this is a drawing titled San Gimignano, and this is a photo of Nicholson drawing on his trip to San Gimignano. At this time, Nicholson worked with renewed focus on and enthusiasm for drawing architectural and what I call landscape architectural scenes, both in Cornwall, elsewhere in the UK, especially at Yorkshire, which is where Redcliffe lived, and abroad. Technical changes also assisted a change in status of these drawings and facilitated a greater level of finish, fullness, or painterliness, while still allowing drawings to be done freely on the spot. From the late 1940s, Nicholson applied a thin wash of oil paint onto his paper ground, which he did quite spontaneously, without subjects particularly in mind. They were then let to dry before being taken out to draw on. And that element doesn't really come across very well, I don't think, in reproductions, especially on the screen, so it's worth to see them in the original if you can. As perhaps suggested by their lack of cohesion over the Biennale party, by 1950, Nicholson and Hepworth were leading increasingly separate lives, and they were divorced the following year. Around 1950 or 51, Nicholson also began a relationship with a local woman named Rhoda Littler, pictured here. It was a bit on off as she would withdraw to her husband, but Nicholson seems to have been enamoured before it ended around the spring of 1953. During this time, I would argue that Nicholson needed Barnes Graham and Lewis for support and at times company. When he went away, he entrusted Barnes Graham with a small hoard of private, presumably slightly incriminating letters to look after, which she did. Barnes Graham's 1951 diary showed the frequency of their interactions. In January, she was hosting 2 of Nicholson's contacts from the British Council as a sort of side bed and breakfast hustle. On Friday the 19th of January, she noted, Frank McEwen and Eric Westbrook from British Council, official visit 7 at Ben's. Saturday the 20th, David busy arranging B Council trip, busy doing house and studio, that's presumably her. Dinner and coffee at Gap, which is a street in St Ives. Ben, Barbara, Terry Frost and other artists, Frank and Eric, David and me. And then on the following spread, ping pong at Ben's, Frank, Ben, Dee and me. The 21st, Frank and Eric brought Ben to my studio at 12, very keen both, especially setting glaciers. Then Ben was back on the 24th at the bottom for David's birthday, as well as more ping pong, and he stayed for the evening. Then on the 26th of January, Ben called and chatted for quite a time. This is just to illustrate the frequency with which visits could be taking place at that time, as well as Ben's love of ping pong. In October 1951, Barnes Graham, Lewis and Nicholson made a trip together to the Scilly Isles. They mostly drew separately, and it seems to have been short-lived for Nicholson as his asthma began to trouble him. What these works together, however, show me, and this is a painting by Barnes Graham of rocks on Scilly Isles on the left, and a stony relief by Nicholson on the right, both from 1953, is how at this time both artists succeeded in very different ways to evoke stone and natural surfaces. Here, Barnes Graham renders stone expertly in paint, creating a wall or rubbed texture achieved primarily through smoothed paint layers. Nicholson did this differently through combinations of form and relief. He carved the board, and also rubbing and scraping away his surfaces, often after he had lightly painted them. Despite their differences, and stylistically these are very different kinds of works, both works, however, seem ultimately to show an incredibly deep interest in the qualities of place and geological, as well as for Nicholson, cultural landscape. And his Carrow, which is the name he gave to this relief on the right, is named after a Cornish site with a prehistoric megalith, which I've included at the top. In the early 1950s, Nicholson seems to have paid great attention to Barnes Graham's glacier paintings, to the point where acknowledgement of their influence on him seems to have become unavoidable. As Barnes Graham neatly summarised later, he signed a picture WBG. He had been affected by my glacier paintings, and his girlfriend RL, meaning Rhoda, said, "There is an influence of WBG, what are you going to do about it?" He replied, "I will credit it to WBG," and he did, and told me so. It is catalogued as such, and indeed this is the work which is titled March the 14th, 52, and in brackets WBG. Considering such works as WBG within Nicholson's broader career, there is a noticeable lightness of atmosphere. And arabesque also plays a particularly dynamic role in the composition. I think this reminded me quite a lot of the arabesques that appear in the glacier paintings from the formations of that landscape. This shape, this arabesque shape, in terms of Nicholson's pictorial still life language, stems from the handles of mugs. But here it is enlarged and no longer tied to particular mug-like forms, but instead creates a strong circular movement or twisting around movement. Planes of still life objects are increasingly transparent, so that we are aware we are looking at an arrangement of objects positioned around each other. And I hope you can vaguely make out some lines in that. Maybe a vase on the left, a glass, and a goblet or something on the right. We're aware we're looking at an arrangement of objects positioned around each other, but cannot be sure, and it really does not matter exactly which objects are in front or behind. At this time, Nicholson arguably became a fan of Barnes-Graham's work. Early in 1952, he started mentioning her to his patron and friend Helen Sutherland. Nicholson had known Sutherland since around 1926, and she had collected his work from not long after. She played a pivotal role in his life, as well as Hepworth's, and Nicholson must have felt she would have enjoyed seeing the work, otherwise he wouldn't have mentioned it. At the end of January, he wrote to Helen, "A very good friend of mine, W. Barnes-Graham, is having a show of her work at Redfern Gallery, as well as some of her work is very fine." And then later in the letter, "She and her husband, David Lewis, are two of my best friends." This impact of her work on Nicholson's was also arguably not a one-off, but part of a movement in his paintings that fed into some of his most graceful classical still lifes of the early 1950s. Another painting from spring 1952 here is on the left, and one from 1953. And apologies, I'm only going to briefly show you these rather than talk about them, but I hope that you can see some of the similarities with the WG painting. Another topic I think worth considering, which I haven't had a chance really to look into, and maybe someone else will, worth considering would be the relationship between these changes in both Nicholson's and Barnes-Graham's work, and Nicholson's development of an etching practice, especially during the late 1940s. And here on the right are two etchings of 1948, owned by Nicholson, owned by Barnes-Graham from that time-ish. I also just want to add a reminder that in the 1950s, Nicholson and Barnes-Graham were working alongside each other. They didn't necessarily see each other's work until after they'd done it, but their studios were in the same building. It was also around this time that Nicholson had bought his first car since before the war, and he revealed in letters that how glad he was to be able to take others into the landscape with him. And I think Barnes-Graham mentions sort of exploration/sometimes drawing explorations with him in this 1929 Blue Midget, which was quite fancy. Nicholson could be quite pushy, which might be an understatement. In February 1954, he again suggested to Sutherland that she take an interest in Barnes-Graham's work. He wrote to her in February, "I'd like to take you to see Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham. Her painting is very much this landscape around here, sometimes merely fierce," I'm not quite sure what he means by that, "and sometimes with a lovely poetry in it." His following remarks, furthermore, show some awareness of gender imbalances in the art world, as well as Barnes-Graham's personal difficulties. He wrote, "She has had many of the problems of opposition that a woman has, and her father a Scottish laird, and she was an eldest daughter not wanted because she was a girl and not a son and heir, etc. And she only managed to break away by endless persistence and getting art scholarships, etc. He's really campaigning on her behalf to me. Willie is still not sure of herself, furthermore, and much too humble about her work to my way of thinking. One's work is what it is, and one does not have to be humble or unhumble about it." And in the same letter, he also expressed his respect for Lewis as a progressive writer who can see what today's painting is leading to. Nicholson's pushiness often worked. Sutherland purchased a work by Barnes-Graham a few weeks later, I think this one, in March 1954, which Nicholson reassured her was one he was also particularly fond of. He knew how to charm. "There is a freshness of idea about it which I like," he wrote to her. Again, he referenced either to Barnes-Graham's predicament as a woman and artist, saying, "I think women painters and sculptors and poets need a special encouragement as it is still an uphill task for them not to do the work but to overcome opposition. If I'd been a woman, what a stick I should have kicked her. I think we can see how Nicholson could then feel quite virtuous in his encouragement of Barnes Graham, as a woman and as a humble woman who needed encouragement and support. Presumably in part inspired by Nicholson's example, Barnes Graham visited Italy in 1954 and 55. One of her first stops seems to have been San Gimignano, and these are 3 drawings of San Gimignano, which she must have known Nicholson had much enjoyed. Notably, she also seems to have discovered an important drawing spot between Siena and Montepulciano, a mountain hamlet called Chiusere, maybe, with distinctive clay and limestone rock formations, as well as oaks and cypress trees, which she drew from a nearby hill. That's Chiusere, top left. This was a drawing trip accompanied by David, and they again combined the stay with a visit to Venice, where Ben was now exhibiting at the Biennale. In August that year, a selection of recent drawings made in Italy were exhibited in St Ives, again at Downings. Nicholson bought a work, Chiusere Tuscany Ivory, which is the top left work here. And later she remembered that she had wanted to avoid telling him exactly where she had drawn such works, for fear that he would also go there, and then that people would think she had followed him. The next time Ben was in Italy in the autumn of 1955, he did indeed draw Chiusere from a very similar spot. And this bottom left is one of those works that he made. After her return in 1954, Barnes Graham was awarded an international scholarship from the Italian government to go back, and so she returned in early 1955, again with Lewis, visiting Milan, Rome, Tuscany, Umbria, Campania and Sicily, and again combining with seeing some of Ben's work abroad, this time at his 1955 exhibition in Paris. While there, she and Lewis also visited Brancusi through Ben's introduction. And here are 3 of Barnes Graham's works made in 1955, as well as Nicholson's drawing bottom left of it, as I've said. Nicholson draws the chasm as being more continuous with its surroundings, like a big indent. Barnes Graham's studies are more piercing in their focus on the internal structure of the clay ground, zooming in on its features in a way that makes it more dramatic and more all-embracing, of the composition and of us as viewers, as we are encouraged to pay close attention to its more harshly outlined internal shapes. In April 1955, Nicholson moved to a house of his own in the heart of St Ives. His new spot was called Trezion on Salubrious Place, which was aptly named for someone who hardly drank, was vegetarian, and apparently took a cold bath every morning. As Nicholson said, it felt about time for a change. It was also a spot he knew well. He had drawn the view from there or from very nearby several times earlier. This is a 1951 example, top right. He noted to a friend that it was also exceptionally good for work. That year, his Paris exhibition also came to its final instalment at Tate in London, and he had a show of recent work at his new dealer's Gamble Fees. Probably around the time of his exhibition, Tate purchased a 1935 White Relief, this one here, and a huge 1937 geometric painting, not the first works of his to enter Tate's collection, but by far the most significant at that point, and probably still today. On the last page. No, I'm not. 2 more pages. It was probably around this time of commercial and art world success that Nicholson gave Barnes Graham a painting by Wallace, which she cherished. Barnes Graham owned 3 by the end of her life, and Ben also had several. Here in the middle is one he gave to the Tate in 1959, and another he gave to Lillian Somerville from the British Council. Another important mutual contact at Tate for Nicholson during the late 1950s was Norman Reed, who in 1955 was deputy director and then director from 1964. Nicholson's generosity towards Tate in 1959 in deciding to give them his Wallace, as well as other things, was connected to a growing friendship with and respect for Norman. London-born, Reed had studied at Edinburgh College of Art in the late 1930s, where he had been a contemporary of Barnes Graham, then both becoming lifelong friends. It was likely a few years earlier, in 1953, that Nicholson gave Barnes Graham a prized White Relief, and not a small one at that, which she spoke of as a thank you for keeping his confidences over his romance with Rhoda. It was a work Nicholson deemed significant enough to make another version for himself to keep with him, and this was something he occasionally did when he really wanted to retain a visual and physical memory of the work. Version 2, on the right, was made in 1957 and travelled with him to Switzerland, where it hung in his house. And there it is. A period of quite harsh change for both artists followed in the second half of the 1950s. This is the beginning of the end. In 1956, Barnes Graham and Lewis moved to Leeds, Lewis to study architecture at Leeds School of Art, and Barnes Graham to take up a short-term art teaching position. It is likely that her painting on the left relates to experiences of snow-covered fields in Yorkshire that winter. By 1956, it is thought that Barnes Graham and Lewis's marriage was also not proving that functional for either party, and at some point she had fallen into a relatively short-lived but meaningful relationship with another artist, a sculptor, who was in St Ives between 1954 and 1960. By 1957, Barnes Graham wanted to return from Yorkshire to St Ives, which she did, partly hastening the breakup of her marriage and subsequent divorce. Her father also died towards the end of 1957. She was very unhappy, and by all accounts put what energy she had into her work. A different kind of change came about for Nicholson. By the summer of 1957, he had a new wife, Felicitas Vogler, a German journalist who came to interview him in May and had agreed to marry him by July. Nicholson left St Ives in mid-March for Switzerland, where he lived for the next 13 years. As far as I know, he never returned to St Ives. Barnes Graham later reflected on that moment as an ending for them both. She wrote, "As Ben talked of life for him being in phases, and as I had a close friendship with him during his Cornish phase, sadly due to other events and partly feeling when he left that was that, after 1958, I never saw him again. Well, he'd gone to Switzerland. I wrote to him on Winifred's death, 1981, but by then he was over 80 and had a short time left himself." Needing some space from St Ives, Barnes Graham moved to London in 1960 or 61. That winter she inherited from her maternal, aunt, Balmonger Estate in Fife, which needed a lot of work. From January 1961, she rented a top floor studio flat in Putney, while letting out her home in St Ives. Having put money down for a new-build studio flat in St Ives, which would be completed in 1963, she also gave up her Portsmouth studio to Nicholson's son Simon, which she later much regretted. He left shortly after and it was handed on. She did, however, move into her new flat, number 1 Barlaloft, in 1963. Hepworth sometimes painted from a studio in the same block. Barnes Graham's reminiscences of Nicholson, written in the 90s, continued, "I felt his death very deeply, he died in 82, and realised his friendship and encouragement meant more to me than I had realised, that it was an end of an era, like his awful departure in 1958. But there was too an element of relief. I was to feel more free, and a bit later I burst forth." This statement to me expresses a dual kind of friendship, one that she valued and would miss, but also one that caused her some strains or constraints. She seems to have enjoyed a kind of freedom following his departure, probably from what could at times be his quite overbearing presence in St Ives. What I don't think I've at all been able to do justice to in this presentation is the range of other contacts Barnes Graham was developing through the 1940s and 50s, mobile and as aware as ever, as well as important shifts in her painting that much more evidently aligned with other developments made in St Ives but also elsewhere, such as Victor Passmore basic design, Nicola de Stael, Taschism, abstract expressionism. These were, among others, for Barnes Graham also compelling parallel lines of inquiry and artistic movements that she contributed to. What I would like to end by saying is that people don't entirely change overnight. And just as both Nicholson and Barnes Graham's training and backgrounds continue to shape their approaches to life, work, and their subject matter during the 1940s and 50s, so their friendship and shared artistic concerns continued to re-emerge in their work throughout their lives. While their friendship might have, to most extents and purposes, ended, the strength of their understandings of each other and their strong engagement with each other's work at such an important and relatively long time in their lives continued to make its presence felt, I am sure without either of them even being conscious of.